Brilliant. Thanks, Dominic. Appreciate it. Just to say one line about myself, I'm Kartik Akileswaran. I'm a co-founder of Growth Teams, which works on trying to help governments in developing countries to deliver on their economic growth strategies. So Kurtis and I sort of work in a similar space, and we know each other since at least a couple of years now. So I'm looking forward to the conversation, and I've promised him ahead of time that I won't be too hard on him. So let's see how that goes. Um, just uh, just as one point of background, I think we'll aim to chat with Kurtis for about 40 minutes, and then 20 minutes of Q&A. The Pathways to Progress team can correct me if I'm wrong. Great. So Kurtis, I think we will get into it. Um, I've sort of put down a number of questions and grouped them into a few different categories. So the first set of questions that I had was sort of connected. Yeah, it was sort of connected to your personal background. So the what I'll start with is your academic and professional experience primarily centers on global development, as Dominic was alluding to. Um, how do you think that connects to progress studies, and why should the global development community pay more attention to progress studies?
Yeah. So I mean, Kartik, me and you have had, I think, several conversations on this front. I think if you read some histories of international development and global development, I think the early history of this space. So, for example, I'm thinking of like Harry Truman gave a speech in, I believe it was 1948 or 1950. It was like the first time the U.S. had defined quote unquote development strategy to help get poor countries to rapidly catch up to rich countries. And you read speeches like that and others from the early history of this space, and you get a sense that it was really ambitious. It was like, let's bring modern science and modern industries and modern organizational practices rapidly as we humanly can to poor and middle income places. And let's have this be a defined goal of rich countries across the world. And you're struck by this sense of ambition and scale and urgency, right? And I've been now in this space for 10 plus years, and you contrast that early scale, urgency, ambition of these early speeches with um, readings and sort of what the curriculum that students of international development are given today. And overwhelmingly, that the curriculum is filled with sort of um, um, studies and randomized control trials and how do we marginally impact and improve this poverty line of $1.90 or $2 per day. And it strikes me that those are two categorically different things. This early ambition and scale and urgency of rapidly transitioning modern science and industry and organizational practices to poor places is just a categorically different thing than this curriculum of kind of does doing a randomized control trial on giving bed nets to the son or the daughter marginally increase the take up of anti-malarial bed nets. And so I think this is what global development can learn and take from progress studies is this boldness and this focus on how do we focus on transformation and not just sort of mitigation. And I'm Canadian, and there's this author, Emily St. John Mandel, and Dominic, you mentioned Tyler Cowen. I actually think she's been on his podcast. So she's a Canadian author. She wrote a book called Station 11, which went like viral during the pandemic because it's about a virus that wipes out a lot of the planet. And there's a great line in there that said, it said, survival is insufficient. And I think that line struck me being a student of international development. Like a lot of international development is focused on sort of survival and just sufficiency, self-sufficiency. and not enough on transformation and ambition. So I rambled. I'll stop there, but that's what I think international development can learn from progress studies.
That's great. Please don't be ashamed of the rambling. I think that was great. I'll ask the reverse question now, which is why should the progress studies community care more about global development, or if you want to frame it in a slightly different way, care more about economic growth in lower and middle income countries?
Yeah. So my first of all, I agree with your characterization of the question. I think progress studies, as I read it, and kind of in the Q&A, the folks can push back on this, but I think the overwhelming focus is often on the frontier countries at the growth frontier, and kind of pushing that technological and scientific frontier outwards, and not enough focuses on countries within the frontier. And I think that the main reason the progress studies community should focus on more countries within that frontier, on countries, poorer countries, lower middle income countries that want to push out towards the frontiers. A simple matter of like mathematics, right? There's just way more people, way more brains located within that frontier when you have countries like China and India. Sub-Saharan Africa is going to be the only region driving human population growth after 2050, middle of this century. And so I think just by the sheer calculus that the vast majority of the number of human brains after 2050 are going to be located in low and lower middle income countries. Therefore, the progress studies community, if they're interested in pushing the frontier in innovation, innovation requires more brains being applied to finding and discovering new ideas. And therefore, by like a simple matter of demographic calculus, we ought to care more about more brains from low and lower middle income countries being dedicated to pursuing new ideas, discovery, and the latest science and whatnot. So that's my very simple answer.
Yeah, as might not be surprising, I absolutely agree. And just to plug something that actually we worked on with the Charter Cities Institute last year, with their research director, we wrote a piece exactly on this topic. So if people are interested, they can find that on the Progress Forum. Great. And then sort of the last question I had that's sort of connected to your personal background, I'm going to channel Tyler Cowen for, which is in your past, people may not know, Kurtis, that you've worked as a general manager at a wine estate, I believe, and
a wine store, yeah.
A wine store, okay, and in sales for a social media software company, if
Yeah.
my internet research served me well. So I'm curious, what, if anything, did those roles teach you about human progress that's different from what you've learned in your research and academic experience?
Uh, okay, so I mean, the a few things. So on the wine front, I like wine. This is why I was, and so I think the main thing you learn there that actually has applications for, my work at CCI and my interest in institutions is like the the same seed, planted in different, it's like slightly different soils, you reach a completely different outcome, right? And so I think that has relevance for institutions and sort of wanting to copy, transplant institutions from one place, one environment to another. There's some relevance there. I think the better answer though is like both of those positions you mentioned at the wine store and then the social media management, the tech startup I worked at called Hootsuite. They both involved sales, and researchers are, and most folks in the international development community are really shitty salespeople. like like at the end of the day, if you want your ideas or your research to persuade anybody or spread or have any sort of impact, you've got to sort of go on this persuasion campaign and think about how is the best way to sell this idea. And I don't think researchers are like at all well equipped to do this. And it's it's about telling stories. It's like the wine thing. People don't very few people like know wine. It's kind of like a status commodity and whatnot. Oftentimes, what makes folks attracted to particular wineries or vintages or whatnot is the story behind the vineyard and the grower and and um and so yeah, I would say like that's probably the better answer is it taught me sales. And I think the other thing I've learned is the higher you move up in an organization, the more and more your role actually becomes about sales. It basically becomes about persuading people, right? Because if you're at the top of an organization or towards the top, you're equipped. Your job is to set a vision and then persuade people to get behind that vision and implement it. And so, yeah, it's the sales aspect of those two roles.
Yeah, that's great. That's something that I think I've learned from you actually, since we've gotten to know each other. So that was great. So we'll just move into some of the more uh, you know topical questions, I guess you could call them, that are sort of the subject of your day-to-day work around charter cities. Um, so maybe to set the scene, I'm curious to hear what you think might be the primary drivers of economic growth in sort of the coming in this century, and how might these vary from historical drivers of growth?
Yeah, so I think my read on economic history is I think political fragmentation. Um, to me, that's the story that I buy most is the kind of the transition from Malthusian a Malthusian world of sort of zero growth rates for most of human history to sort of the modern sustained economic growth that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. I think the throughout most of human history, the thing that set up certain countries during that transition from a Malthusian world to the modern world of sustained economic growth is some places had more political fragmentation than others. And I think those places that had more political fragmentation were better set up for the likelihood of growth takeoffs to more occur there. And so let me like unpack that a bit. I think the best person to read on this, if folks are interested, is a recent book by Walter Scheidel called Escape from Rome. It's really good on this political fragmentation question. And I think the reason that it the political fragmentation of Europe was really conducive to growth takeoffs was it just sets up this sort of competition, right? There's a disciplining effect when a particular political unit's people have a very close option to go to if their current political rulers are poor governors, right? If they produce shitty rules or don't enforce those rules or implement those rules effectively, you have this other option right there that you can then go to relatively easily. And I think that imposes a disciplining effect that imposes competition between those units so that this king wants to increase their tax revenue. So if they get the merchants from this other king to come over and set up shop in their jurisdiction, they get access to their tax revenue. So there's nice competitive dynamic. And then I think it's more conducive to like inspiration. So this nearby king from this political unit can see that this guy introduced this policy that resulted in more growth and therefore more tax revenue. So then he can copy and emulate that policy that nearby king implemented in that neighboring country. And so to me, that the benefits of political fragmentation in sort of a competitive governance environment, inspiration, and then just experimenting with more and different rules across many different units, it sets up this sort of evolutionary dynamic where you can converge on better rules over time. And I think that's what happened in Europe, and that explains in large part why the Industrial Revolution happened in England and not in China. So that's to answer like the first part of your question on what the historical drivers of economic growth. I think in the 21st century, right, we're in the knowledge economy now. And so I think the fundamental driver of economic growth in the 21st century tends to be um, new ideas. And so I think back to my point of the more brains that are human brains that are dedicated to pursuing new ideas and scientific breakthroughs and new discoveries or new forms of industrial organization, the higher economic growth will tend to be. And so those are two kind of um, fundamentally different modalities of growth, and I think they're related, but they're distinct. They're distinct enough. I think the former political fragmentation focuses much more on institutions, and I think the latter focuses sort of on high human capital talent, sort of like right tail talent, and cultivating that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So maybe following up on that last point, um, what role do you see for charter cities in um, facilitating progress moving ahead? And does that role vary depending on whether we're talking about, high income countries at the technological frontier or versus, lower income countries that are trying to catch up?
So I think charter cities. So CCI focuses on charter cities in poor countries, right? Our vision, our mission is to help create these new cities with better governance to lift tens of millions of people out of poverty. So we're very much focused as an organization on low and lower middle income countries, and the reason is right. The logic goes that charter cities can help improve governance in currently poorly governed areas by concentrating reforms on sort of greenfield spaces in which there's a lot fewer political interests and vested interests that are resisting reforms. So therefore, you can get a lot deeper institutional reforms in those concentrated greenfield spaces than you otherwise would be able to at the national level. So it's like this political hack to get around the vested political elites at the top who are often resistant to needed institutional reforms, right? And so that's great because I think in poor countries, you do have this really bad political equilibrium where countries tend to be trapped in low level institution traps, and it's a way to get out of that trap. And you can get like in poor countries, you can get like 10x improvements in institutional quality through something like a charter cities relatively easily because of how bad the status quo is. I think the improvement you can get through charter cities in rich countries is just much, much lower. You can definitely, like, there are problems with institutions in rich countries, but the sort of 10x magnitude, I don't think is like feasible or possible. I think you can maybe do like 2x, maybe three, but it's just a lower level magnitude of improvement. So this is why we want to focus on poor countries. Um, what was the other part of your question, Kartik? Remind me.
Yeah, so I was sort of asking about um, in the context of how you sort of see the key drivers of growth going forward, what role charter cities have to play there, right? So, to be more concrete, you were saying sort of new ideas. That's sort of what's going to drive growth going forward. How might charter cities, um, you know, um, interact with that sort of view of how growth
Yeah,
is going to happen?
yeah. So that's better. So again, I think the mode of charter city implementation in poor countries will be doing it's doing catch up growth. And with catch up growth, you can catch up very rapidly by simply just kind of copying or emulating kind of what exists, like what works in the world today, and you can emulate it. And so it's relatively easier, right? I think for charter cities in rich countries, again, CSAD doesn't focus on this because our mission is around poverty alleviation, but for charter cities implemented in rich countries, while the institutional improvement possibility is lower, I think there's still scope for experimentation, right? And there's huge value in being able to experiment with different rules in these units that are given some autonomy to engage in policy experimentation at the local level and then pinpoint what works, what doesn't, and then you have a demonstration effect that can then be scaled up across the broader country. So I think, for example, like Prospera is a very well known charter city in Honduras, right? But it's sort of oriented towards like digital nomads that want to go live on this kind of tropical island in Roatan and work remotely. And so it's not super focused on poverty alleviation, which is why CCI hasn't got involved in it much. But I still see a huge value proposition in something like a Prospera existing because it is experimenting with these new policies that no other polity on earth is engaging in. So things like 3D property rights, it's looking at, right? So you not only as an owner of property in Prospera have an ownership in the actual building and land of a particular piece of land, but you have ownership over the sort of air above your house, right? And that might encourage folks to build up more and build more densely. And so things like that that have not been tried before that have a ton of possibility to improve governance across rich countries, I think has huge value proposition for rich countries. But again, it's just not a focus of CCI. We're focused on the lower income, more catch up growth.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We may come back to Prospera a bit later on. I have a question related to that. But before we get there, just a couple more on this topic. So I'm curious how you see recent advances in technology intersecting with the development or the emergence of charter cities. So are there any, for instance, are there any particular technological innovations that are ongoing right now, or that may come about relatively soon that you believe will make charter cities even more powerful, or perhaps render them less useful?
Yeah. So I mean, the two relatively new technologies that come to mind on this one are like AI advances and then like cryptocurrency. And so, for AI, I don't know how many of you guys have read any pieces of legislation or laws. They're really crappy reads. These things are like horrible. And then for businesses, even like especially small and medium businesses, never mind the medium scale ones or the larger firms, but for these small mom and pop shops, which the vast majority of firms in low and low middle income countries are small and medium enterprises. For these guys to have to sift through this kind of these laws and these legislations in order to be compliant with them is a huge time suck and a huge increase in transaction costs for these guys that can't really afford those transaction costs. And so I think there's a huge scope for AI, and I know there's already some organizations working on this, for AI to be able to write clearer, shorter, less confusing, less convoluted regulations and laws and pieces of legislation. And so I would say like that's one of them that's related to our work at CCI. And then yeah, I mean, I think on the cryptocurrency front, that's pretty self-explanatory. I think like a lot of currency in low and low middle income country has the tendency to be, devalue rapidly. A lot of macroeconomic environments in these places are super inflationary. And so to have an alternative currency that can sort of be a hedge against the risk in the country's currency is probably a good thing. And so I think cryptocurrency is another recent technological innovation where you can have some unique rules that apply to cryptocurrency within a charter city to help experiment and figure out what's the best regulatory framework for these things before you scale it up to the host country as a whole, because it's a new thing. We don't know what scaling certain cryptocurrency regulations will bring about. So doing it on a small scale first would help us converge on a more optimal regulatory framework for these things. So those are the two that come to mind: AI and cryptocurrency.
Great. Um, so just to perhaps dig in a little bit on some of the you know characteristics and even examples of charter cities. So just shifting gears a little bit. Um, one question I'm curious to hear from you on is, you and various other folks at CCI, often give um, some of the well-known examples of charter cities or SEZs or similar types of initiatives to sort of make the case for what you're doing. I'd be curious to hear, what do you think is the most underrated example of a charter city, or alternatively a new city, or even an SEZ, and why do you believe that it's the most underrated?
Okay, so there are like multiple ways I could go. I could give like a cheeky answer. Uh, so my I think yeah, people to your point, when they talk about charter cities in the space, they talk about like Hong Kong, they talk about Dubai, they talk about Singapore, they talk about Shenzhen. Those are like the tried and true, the most common examples. Sometimes they'll talk about city states in Renaissance Italy or something like that if they're a little more sophisticated. I think to me the one that's not used in this space enough that should, especially given our audience, is like the United States itself, right? It was this relatively greenfield land, where a bunch of folks opted in voluntarily to sail across the Atlantic. um, they were given a new jurisdiction to set up new rules on this relatively greenfield land, and then ultimately test out a new governance system at a small scale in this relatively small colony in this greenfield land. Um, Pinpoint how this governance system can be structured in a way that works, and then pinpoint demonstrate to the rest of the world that it can work, and then the rest of the world saw that and scaled up that governance system, scaled up democracy across the planet. And I think that was a huge net win for the entire world. And so that kind of follows the logical steps, the logical kind of value propositions of charter cities is greenfield land, voluntarily opt into a new jurisdiction, a new governance system on this land, test that out on a small scale, pinpoint how it can successfully work, and then scale up the successes. And so, yeah, given we're in the US, given a lot of our audience and donor base is in the US, we should probably use that example a little more.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Very good answer.
Yeah.
So yesterday, uh, yeah, I believe it was yesterday. This is coming back to Prospero in Honduras. The New York Times Magazine published a piece on Prospero. I don't know if people have seen it, but um, Curtis spoke about it a few minutes ago. Um, and the piece sort of makes it appear that the project has essentially, or maybe is in the process of falling victim to this time inconsistency problem that governments routinely face, which is that when a particular project is conceptualized, the government be uh, might approve it, might be okay with it, give it the go ahead, etc. But now that this project in particular has gotten underway and shown some amount of traction, the government is now sort of more skeptical, critical, that they're trying to get in on the action, so to speak, trying to figure out how to benefit from this project that initially would have seemed quite quite risky. So I'm curious. Prospera sort of followed this public-private approach that, Curtis, you've spoken about in other forums, and it's sort of like the preferred approach that, at least in my understanding, that CCI advocates for when charter cities are being developed.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, in this context, is this challenge of time and consistency, or in economics, you can call it credible commitment. Is that just unavoidable, right? So in the sort of initial conception, in Romer's initial conception of charter cities, I think the way that he envisioned getting around that was um, having a foreign guarantor come and sort of administer the charter city. And the idea is that would, among other things, help to solve this credible commitment problem. But I think in this public-private sort of setup, I guess I'm wondering, is this credible commitment problem always going to be there? And what does that imply for the ability of charter cities to uh, provide better governance in practice? Even if on paper it seems like they could, in practice, does it mean that it's going to actually be much harder because governments can't credibly commit to not trying to expropriate or interfere?
Yeah, so I'm glad you brought this up because to me, so there are a lot of there's a lot of benefits of charter cities. There's criticisms of charter cities. A lot of the criticisms I think are misguided, but I think this one, the credible commitment problem, is probably the best the best and kind of strongman criticism of charter cities. So I like to address it. So you're right. Like regime A at time A agrees to a public-private partnership to form a charter city at time A, not necessarily committing regime B at later time B to adhere to that agreed to public-private partnership agreement, right? And in our version, in CCI's model of charter cities, we, like you said, advocate for this public-private partnership model as opposed to Romer, who, like you said, wanted a foreign guarantor like a Canada to come in. In the example he used was govern a city scale chunk of land in Honduras under sort of good Canadian rules, and by doing so improve institutions and then spur economic growth in that chunk of land in Honduras. We wanted to very intentionally and very consciously get away from the sovereign guarantor model, just because like number one, we didn't think it was like uh, politically feasible, right? And as you saw from some of the pushback and Romer's early work in this space, sovereignty is a really politically charged thing that citizens rightfully hold dear and near to their hearts in countries across the world, and messing with sovereignty often provokes like understandably and probably for good reasons a lot of resistance and pushback. And you saw this pushback in the early years when he first proposed the idea on a TED Talk in 2009. And so, yeah, number one, this sovereignty version of charter cities to me is not super politically feasible. And then, like, I think the more fundamental reason why we wanted to very consciously get away from this model is I don't think it's like desirable because, you know, you have Canada in his example coming in and governing this chunk of land in Honduras. To me, like countries should learn to govern over themselves and flex like the example you use, Kartik, is like you don't get swole at the gym by watching someone else work out, right? Like, which I love that analogy. Like the way you build muscle is by using those muscles and like practicing the art and science of governing. And so by just kind of like washing your hands and watching those Canadians go well in that chunk of space, I don't think that's gonna encourage much learning and governance improvements in the rest of Honduras, right? And so to me, it's just like not a very desirable. This sovereign guarantor model is not super desirable for that reason. I think by engaging in a public-private partnership where the host country is actually involved in the governing of this space from the beginning, and we're working with private sector actors to govern it more effectively, you're going to flex those muscles much, much more than in the sovereign guarantor model. So that's one of the reasons. But you're right. The fundamental trade-off of this model is that regime B might not like this public-private partnership agreement that regime A in time A earlier had agreed to. And so you use the word unavoidable. You cannot eliminate that risk. It is always going to be there. But what you can do, and what we've said, is you can very much mitigate that risk from occurring in the first place by the way you structure the partnership and the agreement with the host country. So there's international investment treaties like the New York Convention, I think in 1958. There's like most countries in the world are signatories of the New York Convention, and what it allows you to do is if you're a private developer and your assets are seized by a country that's a signatory to the New York Convention, you can go to international arbitration and be given an arbitral award to seize some of the assets of that country from overseas accounts, and you'll be recouped the lost investments that were seized. So that's number one. There's like legal mechanisms to mitigate against this risk of expropriation. I think like best avoid that situation in the first place. And so I think there are a few ways to do that. I think by having there be a revenue sharing agreement between the developer and the host country. By doing that, you give the host country a upside in a financial stake in the success of the city. So by expropriating it, they'd be kind of jeopardizing their own financial stake by jeopardizing this revenue that stems to them every year. Another way to give them an upside in the success of the charter city is give them an equity stake, give them like shares in the development company. And so the success of the development company means that the host country gets more financial upside. Related to this is like aligning in incentives thing and financial upsides. We looked at the development company of the charter city actually floating its stock on a public stock exchange. And so that has a couple of upsides around kind of transparency, and you have to report as a publicly traded company in certain ways that would increase transparency and accountability for the development company, which is great. But what would also, I think, happen is you'd have some very important domestic business actors and political actors likely invested in this publicly traded company, things like pension funds or big insurance funds. And in a lot of low and lower middle income countries, those big business actors in domestic economies, they do have influence on the decisions of the political actors. And so the political actor goes to expropriate this company, and the big pension funds and insurance funds are invested in it. They're being like, please don't do that, or we will not support you in the next election or moving forward. There are several others. Like we've looked at examples where a neutral and very reputable international party is on the governing board of the charter city, or like chairman of the charter city, something like the World Bank, where in the rest of the host country outside of the charter city, there are several World Bank projects going on, and the World Bank is investing in a bunch of their roads or water and sanitation infrastructure or what have you. And then if the World Bank is on the governing board of this charter city, the host country will be disincentivized from expropriating the charter city, because then they'll be jeopardizing their relationship with the bank. They'll be jeopardizing those other projects in their country, and they'll be jeopardizing their access to concessionary loans from the bank moving forward. So again, like back to your fundamental question, it is unavoidable, this commitment problem in the public-private partnership that we advocate for, but that does not mean there aren't a significant number of ways to mitigate that risk of expropriation.
Yeah, that's great. And maybe just to wrap up, one last question that sort of flows from there, which is, how do you envision charter cities evolving over the coming decades? What new models or innovations in this space excite you the most?
So what new models or innovations excite me most? I would say, like, so what I'm most excited about right now and what I'm spending a lot of time on, and it comes back to my point that I think in the 21st century, one of the main drivers of economic growth is going to be sort of high human capital talent in its pursuit of new ideas and getting more brains activated and pursuing frontier ideas. I think I look at demographic trends this century and moving forward, and by 2100, half of human babies are going to be African babies, 5 and 10 human minds are going to be African minds. And then I look at the quality of tertiary and higher education in the continent, and it is abysmal. I went to the University of Ghana for study abroad, and I've given talks at several of these universities and whatnot. And it's a it, it is a hugely underinvested sector, given its importance in growth in the 21st century, and given Africa's prominence for humanity as half of humanity after 2100. We are drastically underinvesting in tertiary and higher education, and so I really see, and this informs CCI's partnership with the African School of Economics. ASE is a Pan-African university. It's got 4 campuses in West Africa, one in Benin, one in Cote d'Ivoire, and 2 in Nigeria. Now it's expanding to one of our charter city projects in Zanzibar, Tanzania. And Leonard Wanchikon, he's a professor at Princeton and the founder of ASE. He's got this Pan-African vision for this high-quality university to be established in each of the African Union member states across the continent. And so I see, number one, there's a double dividend here. Number one, these high quality universities can activate, by being high quality universities, can activate more brains across the continent. And that's great, not just for those individuals, not just for those countries, but for humanity as a whole, given Africa is going to represent half of our species. And number two, historically, universities have been fantastic anchors to really dynamic and innovation focused cities. So, you think of Bologna was the place where like Roman law was reintroduced to early modern Europe. Harvard was a place where a lot of the founding fathers were trained. Stanford, like no Silicon Valley without Stanford. The list goes on. So ASCs can be fantastic anchors for charter cities and attract some of the best and brightest talent across the continent, and make these cities really dynamic places. So that's the double dividend. That explains our partnership with the ASC, and that explains kind of what I'm most excited about moving forward.
Brilliant. I think that's an exciting note to end on. So with that, we have about 15 minutes. So happy to open it up to questions.
Hey, Curtis. Thank you for that, and Kartik, nice work as well. So I'm curious to get your thoughts on like what you think brought about the change in perspective of like global development research and practice generally from this like ambitious Truman vision to maybe today where there's like a less ambition in terms of projects that people take on.
Yeah, and like Kartik probably has opinions on this too, so you should chime in after my answer, Kartik. But like my take is that a lot of countries, like there's a thing in global development called the structural adjustment programs, SAPs, and they're basically like they're also called Washington consensus policies, like basically market oriented policies like deregulation or privatization or shrinking the size of the public sector so the private sector can more efficiently function. And so there was these set of policies that were advocated by organizations like the World Bank and IMF for low and lower middle income countries to adopt. And that was kind of during the 80s and especially the 90s was the heyday of structural adjustment. And I think these policies were ambitious. They were bold in the sort of Truman sense that I started with, but by and large, they were seen as they caused some agony to many countries, because a lot of them had to basically undergo some measures of austerity, which really impacted livelihoods and a lot of people in the short run. And so they were by and large seen by the international development community and a lot of the countries that tried to implement them as failed or harmful. So I would say that is one of the scars from structural adjustment is one of the main reasons where we started this shift from bold ambition and urgency that we heard in the Truman speech in the 50s and 60s to a more narrow and less ambitious, more, I guess, like micro-focused RCT approach to global development, which is, to me, kind of ironic because now some studies being done today by folks like Michael Kremer are showing, yes, there were some short-term harms and short-term adjustments that stemmed from SAPs being implemented in the 80s and 90s. But 2 decades or 3 decades on, we look at the impacts, and the folks that implemented them actually are doing much, much better than those folks that didn't. And so, yeah, short-term costs, but actually long-term benefits to some of the structural adjustment policies. So yeah, that I hope answers your question. And Kartik, I'm sure there are other things that probably tie into this answer that you want to bring up.
Yeah, absolutely. Dominic, I'll just add a couple of quick points to what Kurtis shared. So one is the advent of global poverty lines. So that sort of came about in the early 90s. The World Bank sort of took that on. They decided to do that. And the moment you try to establish one poverty line that cuts across all different sorts of countries that vary along many different dimensions, including their socioeconomic status, that sort of almost, I think, forces you to have a relatively low poverty line, right? Because being poor in India is something that's very different from being poor in the US. And so as a result, we came up, and dollar a day is that was the initial poverty line. And that's sort of it's a nice, going back to what Kurtis was saying earlier about sales and marketing. It's a really nice, tool for marketing, and it has a nice ring to it, right? And so, but a dollar a day gets you nowhere in the U.S., right? But even in India, especially today, but even back then. And so that, I think, focused people's minds on, okay, let's get human beings in these places above a dollar a day. But getting to $1.10 a day is a far cry from having $20 a day, right? But the moment you can say you've gone above the dollar a day, then that person is technically, quote unquote, out of poverty. And so that shaped a lot of, I think, the way development actors engaged in the sort of process of development. And that, I think, shifted their attention more towards sort of concrete micro interventions that could get people above that dollar a day line without thinking about the other end of the spectrum, which is prosperity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then of course the other element here is the domestic politics in Western countries, right? So I think probably since the 1990s, to Kurtis's point, aid budgets were coming under much more scrutiny. And because of that, I think people in the industry became much, much more concerned about things like value for money, being able to sort of attribute different sorts of impacts to the money that they were spending. And that also sort of leads one down the road to trying to focus more on micro interventions that you, as the donor agency, can control, and clearly sort of draw a line between what you funded and what the outcomes are. And so I think that's another contributing factor. Obviously, you can't do such a thing if you're trying to work on sort of a much more diffuse, broader topic like trying to promote growth, right? And so I think that has also contributed to the shift away from these bigger picture questions.
Thank you.
Do I go ahead? Yeah. Hi, Kurtis. Thanks for taking the time to speak. My question was just sort of on the last thing you spoke about, which is institutional reform. And, just to zoom out again, do you think there are any other ways to retain human capital or develop human capital apart from institutional reform? Because in particular, so I'm based out of India, and the problem for India particularly has been over the last, 20, 25 odd years, is that a lot of the smart minds sort of migrate to either Europe or the United States. And there's this sort of chicken and egg problem, right? Because you don't have developed institutions and you don't have uh, you know, quality of life and good jobs and so on and so forth. And so that's why people are sort of moving abroad. But at the same time, you need to create that so people stay back home. So just wanted your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so this actually ties nicely into the last thing I chatted about, which is my excitement for this partnership between CCI and the African School of Economics, this Pan-African university system, and ASE. I mean, Pranab, to your location, ASE in Zanzibar is also partnered with the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. It's the first IIT campus, the first non-Indian IIT campus ever is located 5 minutes away from our Charter City project in Fumba Town, Zanzibar, and is a partner of the African School of Economics. So the reason I'm bringing this up is to your question about how low and lower middle income countries can go about better retaining some of their talent, especially their like right tail human capital talent that otherwise has much better opportunities abroad in places like the United States or Europe. I think cultivating these innovation ecosystems that better puts their talents to use is like one of the main ways to do that. I think the best more like recent thing to read on this is Stefan Durkheim wrote up a note for Open Philanthropy. Open Philanthropy, I mean, probably most of you know this, is one of the larger donors in the effective altruism space. And so this was published a few months ago. And Stefan specifically talks about this issue, like a lot of the brightest minds in these places just they end up going abroad, and so that cripples the emergence of a more high quality system in their domestic economy. So how do we go about fixing this? And his third point in that piece is really about establishing these ASE like these African School of Economics like innovation ecosystems domestically that provide appealing opportunities for right tail talent that serve as an alternative to going abroad to some. Yes. And so, the short answer is it's not easy and it's not going to happen overnight because guess what? The tenured professorship in the US is probably still, more appealing than the domestic option. But I know, by having much more higher quality options available domestically, you're still altering the cost benefits of that calculus. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. Kartik, if you just have time, can I just do a quick follow-up to that? Or
Of course, go ahead.
Yeah. So just about the point about setting up centers like these, particularly in the Indian context, the problem has sort of been that IITs are government institutions, correct? And when you sort of have this system set up in a government institutions where you have tenured professors and it's, being a professor at these institutions is sort of a government job, they can't be fired easily. And, systemic change is just really tough in these institutions. And it just is very hard to incentivize them to, bring about any sort of change because they're happy with this sort of conventional setup, right? You have a decently paying job in India, etc. So just, how do you think that can be solved? And more specifically, how do you sort of encourage stakeholder alignment and incentive alignment in these sort of scenarios?
Yeah, India should have more charter cities. Hey, I think having jurisdictions, right? This is the main value prop. Having jurisdictions that in which organizations and firms can operate under different rules than the host country allows an organization like IIT hypothetically could locate in one of these new jurisdictions. And perhaps in this new jurisdiction, there's liberalized labor laws such that hiring and firing is a lot easier. And so you could better incentivize professors and the administrative staff of an institution like an IIT that's set up to pursue innovative ideas, or not, at least not kind of stagnantly rest on their laurels as a tenured professor and just sort of sit there and teach. So that's a very tongue-in-cheek simple answer, is like use my CCI's avowed solution to these problems. But I genuinely think like this is the main value proposition, is the ability to operate under an experiment with different rules, show that they succeed, and then scale those up across the whole domestic, the whole host country. I mean, Kartik, you're from India. You give an answer on this.
Oh gosh, in the 1 minute we have left, I think I cannot do it justice. But yeah, I mean it's a hard one. I think there's a couple of principles that Kurtis has mentioned, that apply, which is one, there has to be more experimentation, and I think what that implies, what that probably requires, is that there needs to be a little bit of letting go from the public sector side, and more tolerance for the private sector to sort of try things out. And as you probably know, Pranav, that's a big conversation, a big debate going on in India every single day, across all domains of life. Yeah, I think that's probably sort of at the principles level one of the key things that is required. I'm happy to talk in more detail about specifics, offline, but yeah, I'll leave it. We are at time, but perhaps if anybody has one more question, we can maybe take one or two more. Yeah.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for joining. So my question is, how is the relationship between a charter cities administration and the regional or national administration, and what are some challenges you encountered and solutions you implemented while integrating charter cities within the wider administrative landscape?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is the relationship between the charter city developer and the host country, it's gonna be like very context specific. So it's gonna change from country to country. Like I said, there's gonna be this public-private partnership, and to come up with that public-private partnership agreement between the developer and the host country, there's gonna be this negotiation period where each party sits down at a table and says, here's like our vision of this project and what we want out of it. Here's this revenue sharing agreement, government, that we think you guys should be entitled to should the project succeed. Particular nominal sum paid out to the government every given year. That's a proportion of the total revenues raised by the developer. So yeah, the short answer is each partnership will be context specific, tailored to what the developer wants out of the project and what the host country wants out of the project. So for example, our project in Town, Zanzibar that I mentioned, it's really focused on innovation, and it's really focused on technology. And so, that's what most of the conversations with government are focused on this sector. And this is one of the reasons we brought the African School of Economics and IIT is now there into the picture, is this focus on innovation, and that requires high human capital talent, right? Conversely, like we have another project called Small Farm Cities, and that's focused on like agricultural industrialization. So it's a totally different conversation, right? And that will shape the agreement between the developer and the host country. Sorry, Laura, what was the other part of your question?
Like integration challenges between the charter cities administration and the wider landscape.
Yeah, so I think the biggest challenge is other than the commitment problem that Kartik and I already discussed, is like charter cities are long-term projects. And if the whole premise is, okay, you're gonna experiment with particular policies in a small scale jurisdiction of a charter city, you're gonna over time pinpoint what policies succeed and what don't, discard those that don't, scale up those that do across the whole country. the implicit assumption in that sequence of steps is that the host country is going to be monitoring what succeeds in the charter city, and then has the ability to identify successes and the ability and incentive to implement and scale up those successes across the whole host country. That isn't always the case. In fact, I'm going to say across the whole countries, it's infrequently the case. Instead, I think what we'll typically see is more proactive regional governments. India is a great example. Some of its state governments work well. Many of its state governments do not work very well. And so those like more innovative, forward-thinking state governments might be have more of the ability and more of the incentive to monitor what's going on in the charter city and then scale up successful reforms to their own jurisdiction. So that's the biggest challenge, is that I think in this integration between the charter city and those countries, like in addition to the credible commitment problem, this scale up problem over time.
Great. Maybe with that, we can close. I'll maybe hand it back off to Dominic just to leave us with some parting words.
Nothing too much to say. Kartik, Kurtis, thank you so much. This was a very fun conversation to listen to and be a part of.
Awesome.
And I hope to chat more soon, but we're very grateful for you to join us today.
Great. Thanks, guys. This is great. And Dominic, thanks for the invite, and Kartik, thanks for the interview.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Yep. Have a good one, everyone.